welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I am the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today is Marc Greendorfer. He is the president of Zahor Legal Institute. He just wrote a paper discussing the history of the use of terms colonialism and settlerism and imperialism with regard to Israel, and in particular how Marxist entities have historically used those terms and why they are or aren't appropriate, as we'll find out from the discussion. This topic is timeless because these words and disputes around them never go out of style. They've been subject to political controversy over the past several decades and not just in recent days and months. But what prompted me to find interest in this topic at this time is Australia's recent decision to de-recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and as some interpreted it as denying its inherently Jewish heritage. What that means for the political context, for other countries, for BDS supporters, and so forth. We will discuss all of that today. Marc, thank you so much for joining us. Before we delve into the discussion, if you could tell us about yourself, your interest in this topic, and of course the core for the audience, that would be great.
Sure, and thank you for having me, Irina. I am Marc Greendorfer, president of Zahor Legal Institute. I'm an attorney, been an attorney for about 25 years now, and honestly, I started out as a corporate law attorney in New York City doing mergers and acquisitions and securities transactions. And over time, as things started to progress with my career, I realized that it was very good money, but not very much satisfaction. So I started to branch out into activism. And one of the things that really caused me to branch out into activism was, at the time I had moved to San Francisco, and a friend of mine from Israel called me up and said, there's something going on at the Port of Oakland. They're boycotting an Israeli ship. We don't really understand what's going on. It's something called BDS. Can you take a look at it and tell me if you think it's legal? And that actually is what started Zahor Legal Institute. That call from my friend, because I looked at it and I said, well, I don't know. I'm a corporate attorney, but I do have enough of a background in the Constitution and federal law and in interpreting statutes to take a look at this. So I did, and it was very clear from my first look at this that it was something that was very organized. It was probably organized outside of the US. There was no way that they were doing what they were doing in BDS with just grassroots support and without the organizational and financial backing of others. So we started looking into that and realized that these organizations that were providing legal cover for BDS, saying that it's 100% legal, it's not discrimination, it doesn't violate the existing anti-boycott law, that they were essentially just working on a blank slate because nobody else had said anything about these topics. There was no reason to. And so when we started looking into it, we realized that there's an opportunity here to actually fact check the left, fact check BDS, find out what the real issues were with regard to the law, and give people an opportunity to fight back against BDS. And so that really is what we focus on. It's to protect students on universities, to protect companies that are being attacked by BDS activists, and generally to suppress anti-Semitism wherever it exists.
I'm going to begin by being a little bit controversial and raise the question of boycotts and their utility and their legal status, given the fact that boycotts have been in their own time successfully implemented against the apartheid South Africa, and given that the very same voices on the left who unfairly accuse Israel of being an apartheid state, nevertheless claim that boycotts do have a justifiable use in expressing economic rejection of states and entities that engaged in illegal or unethical behavior. So where do we draw a legal and ethical line in using boycotts as a means of expressing free speech
Mhm.
versus using them to unfairly defame others and limit the rights of economic entities in the US or elsewhere to engage in free trade.
Yep, sure. No, that's a question that comes up quite a bit. It's actually one that has been litigated, and the most recent case was in the Eighth Circuit that we participated in. It was a case dealing with the Arkansas Times that the Arkansas has an anti-BDS law. It requires anybody who wants to do business with the state to certify that they're not going to engage in discriminatory boycotts against American allies, including Israel. And the issue there is it's all about the state's expenditures. So the court saw that, and the court said, look, obviously you cannot tell somebody that they can't like walk down the street saying I don't like Israel. Of course, of course that's legal. It's protected by the First Amendment, and there's no question about that. But the question is, and most of the state activity against BDS is in the area of whether the state uses its resources, funding and investments to invest in Israel or to do business with Israel or not. And so these laws are very narrow, and they say if you engage in discrimination, the state's not going to spend money with you, and that's it. It doesn't say anything about individuals walking down the street. It doesn't say anything about BDS organizations being illegitimate or being outlawed. It simply says that the state doesn't have to support discrimination, and it won't support discrimination. And it's very much like any other anti-discrimination law. You look at California, for example, a state that you would never think that would be pro-Israel, but they have an anti-BDS law, and it's all tied into the state's anti-discrimination standards. So that's really the issue here. Is it's not about are boycotts effective? It's that does a state or does a governmental entity have to support those who engage in discrimination? And that is a very clearly, answered question throughout the history of the United States at the Supreme Court, that of course anti-discrimination laws serve an important purpose and they are fully constitutional under the right circumstances.
So would it be fair to say that the state still has the option of whether or not to support those entities based on whether they consider that boycott legitimate or not?
No, I mean, if the entity refuses to certify that the
Mhm.
boycott is not discriminatory, then the state doesn't have a choice at that point. But I mean, again, it's one of those questions that, I mean, is it right for the state to use the taxpayer funds to support an organization or to support a person that is engaging in this type of discrimination? So you wouldn't, I mean, just as you wouldn't want the state saying, well, this person is discriminated against blacks, but we sort of need the business and we don't think it's that bad. Or, should it be that no, it's black and white. If you discriminate, we won't do business with you. You of course can discriminate all you want, but you're just not going to be able to do business with us.
And how does this certification process work? What kind of evidence do these entities need to provide that the boycott and so forth is not, in fact, discriminatory?
Well, they don't. They make that decision themselves, and so they're presented like, let's say, for example, with the Arkansas Times is actually a bad case because they weren't engaging in a boycott of Israel, but others, there are cases in Texas and Kansas and Arizona where Palestinian Arab Americans were presented with a contract that said, among other things, you'll do this and that in exchange for the money that we're going to give you, and plus you agree that you will, and then they just basically used the language of the statute. You agree that you will not engage in discriminatory boycotts of foreign countries with which the United States has active trading. It's not exactly that, but it's to that effect. And so they see that and they know that Israel is involved, and some of the certifications actually do state Israel. And at that point, then they make a decision. Do I want to just, not boycott Israel? Do I want to do business with the state? There is no real assessment of whether the boycott is discriminatory. And that's part of the issue that some of the plaintiffs have had, is that they're saying that it's vague. We don't really understand what it means to engage in discrimination through a boycott. But the boycott certifications are very simple. It's really just one line that says, I agree that for the duration of this contract, I will not boycott Israel, something to that effect.
No, it's very interesting because a lot of these BDS supporters have used the language of apartheid because apartheid is clearly a clearly defined legal term. Whether or not it is factually applied to Israel, the legal meaning of it is fairly black and white, straightforward, and anyone can understand what it is. Now,
Hmm.
facts you can manipulate, distort, or outright fabricate, but legal definitions are what they are. But the terms that are being used to delegitimize either Israel or Israel-related issues such as Jerusalem and its legal status, such as settlements,
Hmm.
colonialism, and imperialism, are not as clearly defined and have a variety of political and legal definition. And this is what you pointed out in your article, and you described this these terms as having a Marxist historical origin. Could you, before we get into these definitions, could
Hmm.
you describe a little bit about the historical context of how they were used in the past and how did those terms come to be and why they were used by the Marxists?
You know, it's a great question. And really, the way that this came to our attention is that around 2020, when the George Floyd riots started, and also with Antifa taking to the streets, a lot of the rhetoric was about decolonize America, that the Israelis were teaching American police how to use these types of tactics that they honed on Palestinian Arabs against American citizens, and it's some sort of form of imperialism. And so, but none of these things were really fleshed out. I mean, you even had people in Congress using these terms, and they clearly didn't know what they meant, and I didn't know what they meant either because they are not legal terms. That's the bottom line. Is that these are terms that really originate in Marxism, the Karl Marx theory of economics and economic development. And so what he was doing was he was describing phases of a country's or a nation's economic development, that they go from, hunting to gathering to farming to being feudal vassals to being that kind of sort of a dependent on the nobility for their economic well-being, to capitalism, where you essentially didn't have the feudal system anymore, and you instead went to a free market system. It's never free market, but that kind of system. And then the evolution is, because there's an inherent unfairness in capitalism, you would then go on to socialism and the end state of communism. That's where these terms come from. They don't have any legal import. And it's actually very hard to get a consistent definition because Marx didn't really define the terms. He simply used them in many cases, and they have taken on a life of their own. And so what you have is you have things like let's use the Palestinian National, I think it's called Covenant or Charter as an example. It is full of these Marxist terms of colonialism, of the usurpation of the assets and the rights of the native population, but there's no legal basis for that. I mean, it's okay. So maybe it is the fact that there is colonialism going on. One, what is colonialism? And two, what is the legal prohibition against it? And the answer is we don't know what it is because it's never really defined in one place. There's no laws about it. And two, it's not illegal. There's no, other than there's one area of law where it comes into play that we can probably discuss later, but there is no legal basis or no legal meaning of a lot of these terms that are used, like colonialism, imperialism, settler colonialism. They're simply terms used because they have a pizzazz, and that people think that they mean something when they don't. And it is a very attractive thing, especially on college campuses where radicalism, is encultured, to use these terms, but they don't really have any meaning.
But from a political and historic sense, there is a connotation that is quite negative with
Mhm.
imperial countries taking over smaller countries or
Mhm.
territories that have not been that were not nation states for the sake of
Right.
acquiring their natural resources and essentially uh, patronizing their populations in an oppressive way. That's basically the definition that comes to mind when we think of all of these things.
Yeah.
And as for settlers, you could basically the idea is that these are people outsiders who are coming in and infringing on the rights of the indigenous or original inhabitants of those territories. Now we can
Yep.
argue how far back we can go with those definitions, given at some point everybody came from somewhere else, and the history of humanity itself is fraught with warfare, territorial disputes, and violent takeovers of each other's territory until we've come to the area of international law, where these disputes are supposed to be settled through litigation and courts and not through violent conflict.
Hmm.
Nevertheless, despite this historical context, this is not really what matters to these groups and these Marxist entities, because the entire point is kind of to move discussion away from this historical common sense, historical context, and into a narrative of victim oppressor that we
Yes.
have seen stymie through the academia for several decades. And we have seen the same objective with the Soviet state backing some of the liberation
Hmm.
movements, which may have had some legitimate point in
Sure.
self-determination, but when backed by the Soviet state, they all took on a particularly violent undertone.
Yeah.
Given this context, do you think it's fair to say that the discussion of liberation movements, the right to self-determination, and territorial disputes, to use completely objective terms, should be in itself decolonialized from these Soviet influences?
I like that term. Yes, absolutely. Because the what you said about the dynamic of this can be boiled down to victim and oppressor. That is exactly what is going on. It's an easy to understand term, and it has great emotional appeal, especially with younger people who they want to see things as black and white. And if they're told, look, the United States is a colonialist entity, or et cetera, and you are oppressing the people, the indigenous people, it makes a lot of an emotional sense, but it doesn't really, you can't really define it, you can't explain it, and you can't act on it because it doesn't really have any basis in anything that we've ever seen before. Usually you have something, a legal basis or a political basis. These things are in a sense made up terms. I mean, they started as original terms, but they are at this point just they have whatever meaning the people who are using them want them to have.
It's interesting that you know that, because the Soviet Union, which backed a lot of these movements and introduced
Hmm.
this rhetoric both into the liberation groups all over the world and into the American and Western academia through
Hmm.
proxies and so forth, it
Yep.
itself could be defined in its own terms as a colonialist state, because
Yep.
it has both the imperial Russia and its Soviet entity engaged in violent takeovers of ethnic minority lands, which are, being oppressed to this day. Now,
Yep.
the question is, what gives hypocritical states and entities the right to introduce these definitions when they themselves embody the very concepts that they are defining? Why has this particular issue not been the subject of much greater debate concerning the use of these terms in the first place?
It's a fantastic question, and I think that what we're seeing in the world right now is the fact that those countries that were essentially formed under Marxist principles are the ones who are the biggest imperialists active today. I mean, you look at Russia and Ukraine, you look at Iran throughout the Middle East, you look at the Palestinian Arabs who were allegedly formed by, I mean, who knows if this is the case or not, but the rumors are that sometime in the 60s, there was a Soviet effort to delegitimize the Jewish state. And so they came up with the Palestinian identity. I don't know if I mean, that's something that I didn't delve into, but it definitely is the case that those who use these terms are the ones who also practice the underlying philosophies. And, at this point in the world, even I think I don't remember the exact author that I cited to, but they said essentially that there is no more imperialism in the world. It essentially ended after World War II. They're wrong though, because there is imperialism and it's happening by the hand of either the Russians or even, if you look at the Chinese are definitely imperialists at this point. When you look at how they will not allow Taiwan independence, they took back Hong Kong. They've had aspirations for the entire sea that surrounds them. So yeah, it is one of those things that I think that it happens a lot in this world where if you want to know who is guilty of something, find out who's complaining about it. That's what's going on here.
So now that we are looking at the very dark origins of all this terminology and how it's been historically used against Israel to deny the history of Jewish presence, to deny indigenous and legal and historic rights to the lands, and to reduce the territorial disputes with Palestinians to a very simple claim that settlers or white colonists came over and take over the land. There is no evidence that there's any attempt that prior to the 1960s there was any effort at state building, by the way, in those territories. There was a presence certainly, but there was no state building project at that point.
Yeah.
So how did it come to be that none of these terms have been not disputed? They were obviously disputed by Israel and its allies, but they have come to take such a strong hold in the political discourse that to this day we refer to individuals of Jewish descent living beyond the Green Line as settlers as opposed to Israelis.
Yeah, no, there really is no answer to that. When you go back and look at the history, it's a very interesting history, and it actually ties back to what you had mentioned before about who really are the imperialists. And when you go back in history, it turns out, and this is what I found in this article that I published, and which shocked me, is that there really is imperialism in the Middle East, and there's colonialism, and it started. If you want to go back to where it started, it's essentially with Muhammad. And it was, Islam is a colonialist, and not entity, but it's a colonialist movement. Maybe not today, but at the start, it definitely was. If you look back, it goes to where Muhammad founded Islam, which is in modern day Medina, which actually was called Yathrib. It was a Jewish city in what is now, I think it's around Saudi Arabia, but it was always intended to undermine the claims of Jews to being a religion and the claims of Jewish people to being a nation.
Well, here I'm going to take a little bit of a sidestep, because those claims that was the intent were made by the very same people who have created the impression that Islam is a religion that is inherently intolerant to the Jewish presence. And I actually think that they were colonialists within Islam who were trying to colonize Islam itself from within to create that very impression. There's no doubt there were internal disputes and factions of Jews some of whom supported Muhammad in his political efforts, and some of whom sided against him with his enemies. So there was no question there were disputes of that sort, but there's no real evidence that there was a religious basis for trying to eradicate Jewish presence in Medina, which is what Yathrib was called, is called now. But otherwise,
yeah, no, I think that I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think that what the history books show is that the initial plan was to bring the Jews into the fold of Islam. Muhammad wanted to cater to them. He wanted them to support this new religion. So yeah, no, I think that you're right. It wasn't intended to deny a Jewish religion. It was intended to evolve it, I guess, for lack of a better term.
For sure, we have seen the same with parts of Christianity that have evolved from Judaic practices, and the history is complicated with some people just wanting to take it in another direction and willing to coexist with Jews, while others wanted the Jews to convert, and so on and so forth. We can delve into who was doing what and at what stage in history, but there's clearly an incentive for some people within Islam, or who consider themselves and the default to represent history in a way that it was fully and 100% intolerant of any religions, including Judaism, which is simply not the historical case. And by doing that, they justify the more modern form of colonialism that we have seen from Islamist movements seeking to impose political religion on existing nation states and groups of people. So it's very interesting that actually the colonials are even trying to in battle their own, I guess, origins. I wouldn't say that they're necessarily the followings of the same religion. I would say it's almost like two different religions competing with each other, just as there were many Christianities, and one would say even different Jewish movements. We can see Karaites and Samaritans who broken off, and arguably they consider themselves the real bearers of the tradition, but thankfully they don't have the same level of violent disputes but they're different streams with the same roots. Similarly, these groups have tried to colonize their own religion by imposing this view that certainly benefits a violent direction and a violent imposition upon everyone else, whether they're also other Muslims or non-Muslims. And
I mean, no, you see that especially between Shia and Sunni. That's probably the most violent conflict you'll ever see on the planet, and it's all about two factions of the same religion.
And politics. We should say that we can actually say it was as much a political dispute as it was a religious dispute in its roots. It was a dispute over legacy. It was a dispute over the fact that at the time the separation between religious streams and politics was not clear, at least in that particular iteration.
I think that it's the historical case that, for example, Iran started out as a Sunni nation. It started out actually before that as a pagan nation, but there was also some monotheism there as well. But it converted to Shia, and now the two biggest competitors are Saudi Arabia as a Sunni nation, Iran as a Shia nation, and that's all politics. That's not, I mean, for the most part, I don't think that the religious element is involved that much anymore.
I would disagree. I think the Islamic Revolution is very much an effort to impose a particular theological doctrine for political means, to be sure, but the level of religious fanaticism in the echelons of Ayatollahs and the RGC, I think, is as real as their political quest for power. So I don't think it's, and I think the religious elements are very much real for the people who follow the religions. Maybe for the political leaders, it may be subservient to their political interests, but Iran's seeking control of the two holy mosques is very much indicates their understanding that religion is very much real for the religious followers. So whether or not they are completely sincere in their adherence to religious principles or have been so corrupted that they cannot tell the difference, they do understand that for the millions and billions of Muslims, the control of these religious entities has a very real theological meaning. But
I think that you're probably right about that. So that is a good point to make.
I do, but bringing us back to the issue of colonialism and settlerism, there's no question that there's been various powers that have taken hold of the particular territory that we now know as Israel and the Palestinian territories and the surrounding areas by various points of time. The Ottoman Empire is but one of them. One of the latest ones, I would say, the British Mandate, of course, and yet we are seeing no outrage about the Ottoman Empire's control of those territories, despite the fact that internally Ottoman Empire was not a blissful haven for all. There has been a great deal of dispute even between Arabs and Turks over various issues. Yes, there was a nominally religious entity in charge of administering those lands, but there was also still a Jewish presence there, Christian presence there, and there were also many internal disputes within the Ottoman Empire as an entity that had nothing to do whatsoever with that very small piece of land compared to the vast territories that Ottoman Empire controlled at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Needless to say, the British mandate, which was completely external and completely, it was imperialist by definition. It was an empire at that point.
Sure.
That too did not seem to generate nearly as much outrage as the Zionist presence in the 20th century. So the waves of Zionism that came, not specifically the Jews who were already residing and coming in waves, but specifically the Herzl-backed Zionist movement. Why is it that there's such a different treatment of all these entities and why is it that the Jewish aspiration for a state has generated a specific kind of outrage that is not prevalent to these previous entities, including again the British mandate, which did not seem to generate all that much opposition from anyone?
That's a question that has yet to be answered. But if you look back, especially in the recent history between the end of World War I and after World War II, most of the nations that currently exist and the borders that currently exist in the Middle East were the result of decolonization from the British, from the Turks, from the Romans, from the Muslims. All of those borders, I mean, for example, Iraq or Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, these are recent entities that were created, the same as Israel, around the same time. So your question is a great question. Why the difference? And the question has to be answered that, well, somehow Jews became seen as white, like the British and the last imperial force that was in the Middle East, and so we get deemed to be the successors to the British as occupiers, when in reality we're the original indigenous people. That's the only explanation that I have for that.
But here's the question that again seems to the focus of attention is again on the Theodor Herzl-backed European Jews who came,
Mhm.
at various points in time. But besides them, there was also a historic indigenous presence of Jews who never
Right.
left. A very small one, perhaps, but it was there. Plus the waves of Sephardic Jews from Yemen and from other countries in the region who migrated out of, personal connection to the land or trade interests or whatever the case may be, that were very much regional and looked like their neighbors and not like Europeans in physical appearance. So, how do these Marxist groups explain and address the Sephardic presence of the Jews who never left or who were there to begin with and who stuck around?
You'll never see them address the Sephardic Mizrahi issue. They revert back to saying, no, Jews are white colonizers from Europe. And there were a certain number of Jews who did come from Europe, but before that, you have to ask, where did you come from? And it reminds me of a story. I was in Israel earlier this year. I was in the old city, and a Palestinian Arab came up to me. He was trying to sell me some jewelry, and I was trying to be polite. And he said, my family has been here for 400 years. This is our store, et cetera, et cetera. And I looked at him and I said, well, where were you 401 years ago? And he got very angry at that, because it's a history of, just like us, they were dispossessed of their land. We were dispossessed of our land. And we ended up, over thousands of years migrating across the world. For example, Medina, Yathrib, was, if you look at the history books, it was the result of the Roman conquest of Israel that the Jews ended up there. So, my own family has both Sephardic and Ashkenazi backgrounds, and it's just a story of how far back do you want to go to find out when you were dispossessed of the land. I don't know the answer to the question of why are they focused on the European Israelis as opposed to the indigenous ones, who never left, whether they were from Iraq or from Syria. But I mean, at this point, I think over half of Israel's population is not Ashkenazi. it is a majority, if you want to call it BIPOC. I mean, it wouldn't be BIPOC, but it would be a majority indigenous people. And they refuse to answer that question. And that's one of the reasons that this paper exists, is that we were approached by students at various universities right after George Floyd riots, when SJP and the likes of that, Students for Justice in Palestine, these campus Marxist groups that support anti-Israel efforts. And they were being told, "You're colonists, get out of here, get off my campus." And we just couldn't understand why they were saying that, especially because a lot of the Jews who are on campus come from Israel. They're clearly of brown skin. You could tell that they're not Europeans. They're not your typical, proper German looking person. But they totally ignore it. They will not address it. And when you push them, what they will say is, "No, you're not really Jews. You're Khazarians," or some other sort of thing where they separate us from our history, and then they say, "You're a recent creation."
Now, I'll get to the point about why whiteness has become almost a spiritual religious edict as opposed to a physical biological concept or
Mhm,
construct or whatever you want to call it. But I want to get to the point about the knowledge of history, because in terms of the Arab presence in the region, there certainly seems very little knowledge of the history of the Arab tribes, who became known in part as Israel Arabs and in other part as Palestinians.
mhm,
Because I don't think there's an awareness of where those people come from. There's this
yeah,
generic claim, oh well, that they're supposedly from Canaan, for which there's no historic
right.
evidence. The fact that of the matter is, many of them migrated from different parts of the what is now Arabic-speaking world, and which
Yep.
did not all speak Arabic at all points in time either. Some of them came from the Arabian Peninsula, some of
Yep.
them were Levantine, some of them came from other areas, and some of them had been there for a very, very long time. But a very small group. Many of them have migrated as 1,200 years ago or whatever, but at different stages in time. And
Yep.
not all these tribes always got along among themselves, even after they all acquired same language and religions, I would say, because some of them were Christian and others were Muslim,
Mhm,
and not all were, the same religion at the same time either. So, given the fact that there's this positive knowledge about this Arab presence in the territory and their history, um, I kind of want to turn this issue on its head and ask whether is it not fair to these Arab groups that are being used by white different, Marxists who don't even know their history, who have no idea where those
mhm.
groups come from, their last names, their histories, their links to the other Arab lands, and what brought them to migrate out of the lands. Sometimes, by the way, the answer is they were simply kicked out.
Yeah.
So the question is, without understanding the issue of the Arab presence in territories, can we really understand what the so-called claims to colonialism, settlerism are all about?
Yeah, it's one of those things that I think that for the first point is that for the longest time, nobody really lived in that land. It was desolate, and you go back even to the Exodus. The Exodus happened because of famine and drought, and people just moved without borders from one place to the next where life would be easier. So the question of, were there really Palestinian Arabs? I mean, yes, of course there were Arabs in that land. There were nomads, there were Jews, there were polytheists, there were any number of people who wandered across that region over time looking for their fortunes or looking for better opportunities. But the issue of a Palestinian Arab identity and presence in that land is hard to reconcile with the history. I mean, even if you go back to when Yasser Arafat was relevant, when they were forming the PLO and they came up with the Palestine National Charter, they came up with a artificial dividing line of 1947 to determine who was really a Palestinian. And it's built into the Palestine National Charter. It says if you were a Palestinian Arab in 1947 who regularly lived in this land, you are a Palestinian. If you were born to a father who was a Palestinian after that time, you're a Palestinian. But if you're a Jew only if you resided in the land prior to 1947 will you be deemed a Palestinian for citizenship and statehood purposes. Problem with that is that by 1947, most Jews had been expelled from the land. And so it was a very convenient way to create a dividing line where you could say, well, look, we've accommodated the Jews. The Jews who were indigenous here will be dealt with, or will be given rights. Problem is that, like my family had been kicked out thousands of years before that. And so are you saying that just, like if you look at even the topic of this, Australia, or if you look at Native Americans or anywhere else, you could always come up with a dividing line where they didn't exist, or where they were expelled and where they didn't have, you know, identity as a state, as a nation, or borders. So, that's in part what happened is that, let's say that we instead had it in an Israeli national charter. We said any Jew who was present in this land normally at the time of the first temple is an Israeli, and anybody who is a son of a mother who was Israeli based on that definition is also Israeli. Well, there you have it. There you have every Jew on the planet is then therefore an Israeli. That's how they did it, is that they just came up with these artificial definitions and artificial timelines.
Now, all of that brings no one any closer to resolving their political and territorial differences, because these arguments over definitions, quite frankly, don't really matter to anybody. If you ask most of the Arab world to sympathize to the Palestinians, they've been conditioned into accepting the way they are. But if you ask them, do you want them living among you? No, they consider them as different people. They don't consider them Arabians or Lebanese or Egyptians. They consider them as separate, distinct tribes. Nevertheless, they've been conditioned to see this as a pan-Arab, pan-Muslim issue of, well, us versus them, and that's as far as it goes. Linguistically, there are dialectical differences. Culturally, there are significant disputes, and historically, they don't see anything in common with those people outside this one issue. So it's become an emotional discussion, not a historical or legal one, because quite frankly, if you ask some average supporter of the quote-unquote Palestinian cause, they don't really care how far back it goes and who, what else happened and by whom. They don't, they can even acknowledge that Ottoman Empire was not such a great thing, but for the Arabs in the region, but nevertheless, it's over, it's done with, it's gone, and right now, but Israel exists, or this issue has been mishandled, and whatever they know about it, they don't really even care who was right and who was wrong. They just see the current situation, whatever you call it. And this colonialist idea is no longer about the definition, the correct term, or understanding the history. It's about an emotional, tribal, or I wouldn't say even tribal, sectarian division that has been created and has been fed for decades and has become a mindset in itself, regardless of the history and roots. I don't think anybody wants to study it necessarily, and frankly, unless you start studying it from childhood in school, understanding all the histories of all the tribes and everybody else in the region, I don't really see any way of getting over that particular problem, because it's being taught for generations in every soft power institution, and the definitions are not relevant here. It's more an emotional context and more about an embedded, entrenched sense of identification with a particular grievance or perceived grievance versus some other who it is not your own or is farther away from your own for various reasons.
Yeah, no, I mean, the emotional side of it is, I think, what gives it power. And, I think it's a reality at this point that in large part, the United States is becoming a majority minority country. And as a result of that, you have groups that, here in the United States that have been discriminated against and that have been denied opportunities, Blacks, Native Americans, any number of groups who now see common cause with the groups that use these Marxist terms that really don't apply anymore, but it resonates with them when, for example, you see Black kids on campus who were taught, all about slavery and all about how they were taken, dispossessed from their land in Africa and brought here as slaves. They identify now on an emotional level with the idea that, okay, and so I look at Israel, and Israel looks to be white, and they have a British background, and there was some dispossession there. So I'm going to side with the group that is now siding with me. That's a hard thing to overcome. And that's one of those things that we're really struggling with. And that's part of the reason why I wrote this paper is that we've had people from university campuses, UCLA, Stanford, Northwestern, come to us and say, what do I say? I'm being told that I am a settler colonialist. I don't know what that is, but they're shouting me down. They're not even letting me talk in class as a result of this. And the administrations, because they have this push for ethnic studies or critical race theory, which embodies Marxist thought, even though it doesn't, it's not really Marxist thought, they're being energized by the administration and the curriculum. And so, we need to get out there and really discover what these terms mean and what the history is behind it. Because at the end, we could also be called the non-Indigenous people, Jews, the Canaanites, or whoever was there before. Of course, they don't exist anymore. But if you go back far enough, everybody has a grievance. I don't know how to answer the question of how do you reconcile those things? How do you resolve the issues? Because I don't think that you're going to until you get people who no longer want to profit politically from this dispute.
Well, before we get to the political context and the profiteering, I do want to discuss the academic issue that you've just identified. The crux of the problem is the so-called Marxists are not really Marxists because they've never read Marx. You cannot be a follower of something if you don't even know what it is, or you have a completely distorted and inaccurate view of what it is. Maybe they would have been Marxists had they read Marx, but as you correctly pointed out, they're using the terms incorrectly and inaccurately. In fact, even the Soviet Union and most of the so-called communist states were never pure Marxists to begin with.
No, of course. No, I mean, and that's one of those things that, if you look, and what I did is I looked through people who I would have never read otherwise because I just, I found them distasteful. I had to read Marx. I've read Marx before, but I had to really read it in depth. And it was very interesting to read. Edward Said, I read a lot of his work because, he is one of the primary promoters, or was the primary promoters of the Marxist terminology in the Middle East. This guy, Verancini, who is a settler colonialist professor expert, I also read that. And when you look at all of the definitions that they use, there's absolutely no way they apply in the current context. Settler, and I don't know if I'm jumping ahead here, and please let me know if I should wait on this, but settler colonialism really means where you're taking over a land not for the financial gain that you could have, but simply to replace an indigenous population with your own. So if you're calling Jews settler colonialists in their own homeland, what does it mean? I mean, how can you say that? You're saying that you are settling your own land. It makes no sense, but they still say it.
You just brought up another key point, which is this idea of replacement. There are obviously key points in history when people are either forced out of their homes or they have to leave under economic or other pressure, or otherwise their lands are confiscated and so forth. But today, I'm not talking about 50 years ago, 70 years ago, or 200 years ago. I'm talking about today. There's no such confiscation ongoing. And to the extent that the issue has been somewhat settled, some of the people who claim to have been victims of colonialism and so forth, they don't even live in that land. They make claims to it, but it's ridiculous. It's like making claims to, a place of pogroms 500 years ago somewhere in England. Who is actually going to go and dispute that? Even if you do have the deeds to this house, it's not even realistic. And okay, maybe you should be compensated, but by whom? And I mean, some grievances may very well be real, but are they really worth litigating unless you want the conflict to continue, and unless you're holding the current groups responsible for everything that happened thousands of years ago, which is equally absurd.
Yeah.
So now we have the so-called Palestinian refugees who have American, European citizenships, who are doing better in their new homes than they would have been doing under Palestinian Authority, for instance, for sure.
Oh, yeah.
But so how do we realign these completely inconsistent definitions? On the one hand, you have people who have a historic and religious link to the land, being called settlers, colonials, outsiders. On the other hand, you have people who have not been living in the land for decades and have citizenships of other countries. And I'm not talking about the so-called refugees in Arab lands who are not being integrated. I'm talking about Americans, Europeans, and people living in the country where they have received a new legal status. Still claiming to be refugees when such a definition does not apply to anybody else on the face of the planet, and we have plenty of territorial disputes and unfortunately people even being ethnically cleansed. Nevertheless, even those who have been genuinely ethnically cleansed 50 years from that point don't call themselves refugees. They call themselves whatever they are, wherever they are. So we have this legal definition that is actually enshrined now in international status because of UNRWA and other UN entities and European groups and that are recognizing an identity that legally should not have that status. It just does not. It's special and separate from any dispute in the world. So how can this be legally resolved when people are giving a legal status to something that doesn't actually exist, that cannot be?
That's the core of the issue. I mean, when you look at what happened between, for example, India and Pakistan, there you have again a Muslim population and a non-Muslim population claiming essentially the same land. And that was resolved, although there's still disputes to this day, but that was resolved essentially by population transfers. And I'm not advocating that, but I'm just saying that throughout history, there has been compromise on this issue where you had competing claims to the land. That's simply off the table here. When you look at what the Palestinian activists say right now, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Well, that's not a compromise. That's an eradication of Israel, of the Jewish state. And the answer really was given to them at the time of decolonization from the British when Transjordan was formed. But for whatever reason, they absolutely refused to accept that, okay, there's two people, one land. Let's try to come up with some sort of division here where each side gets something. No one's going to be perfectly happy. It simply is not agreed to. Even though, the existence of Israel really is the result of a compromise. If you look at, the Jewish history, the West Bank, Hebron, Nablus, all those places are historically Jewish places, and Jews, for the most part today, don't lay claim to them. In the same way that Palestinians lay claim to, like, all of Jerusalem, for example. There simply has to be, a give and take, and there isn't a give and take on the Palestinian side or on the anti-Israel side. And that's really where this is going to be resolved, is when someone comes up with a solution that allows both sides to make a compromise.
Well, it seems to me pretty clear that the problem is the fact that anti-Israel side, meaning people who hate Jews just because they're Jews or hate Israel because it's Israel, have merged with the pro-Palestinian side, people who legitimately think Palestinians have some sort of a, self-determination claim, which is not an illegitimate point, but they have merged, and the only way to be a pro-Palestinian activist is to be anti-Israel.
Yeah, and not just anti-Israel, but a no compromise anti-Israel, like not even an inch of land to the Jews. And what they say is that, and they keep repeating this, and we see this in court as well, that being Jewish is a religion. It's not a nationality, it's not an ethnicity, and therefore you don't have a right to anything. We are Palestinian Arabs. We are the ethnicity. We are the indigenous people. And that's where it all, to sort of close the circle here, the only legal element of this that exists is the rights of indigenous people. There is a UN Declaration of Indigenous Rights, and it's very clear what the indigenous people have a right to. And so that's the only, when you talk about colonialism, settler colonialism, imperialism, no legal effect to those terms. Indigenous people, there is a legal effect, and indigenous people under the UN Declaration of Indigenous Rights have a right to self-determination, self-governance, to take advantage of their natural resources, to have their culture, not be assimilated. And so the question then is, okay, so between all of these groups, you have Muslims, you have Arab Muslims, you have Arab Jews. Who really is the indigenous person who gets the rights here? And they can't answer that, because we can't answer that either. I mean, the only thing that we can say is that if you go back, 2,400 years or whatever it was, we were the indigenous people, and now we're being dispossessed of that title, and so now somebody else is saying that they're the indigenous people. Again, though, does that really have any prospect of resolving this issue? I don't think that it does.
Now, very interesting that you keep using the term indigenous, and we have had no shortage of historic artifacts that have been in part destroyed, but in part preserved by the Israeli and other authorities, presented to the international community as evidence of continuity of Jewish presence in particular territories, including Jerusalem, in particular Jerusalem, actually. And here we are, prior to getting to Australia, we have had UN resolutions denying any Jewish connection to Jerusalem. Not just that it's partial, not just that Christians, Muslims, and whoever else there has competing or equal claims and needs protection and so forth, but that the entire city has nothing to do with Jewish heritage. We have had UN resolutions that were never removed or denounced. Now, you could say that UN does not determine reality on the ground, and I very well agree with that. And anyone who takes these things all too seriously has only themselves to blame for putting that much importance into meaningless, toothless resolutions that are physically unenforceable. But nevertheless, there still it is used in the academia specifically to delegitimize Israel there and to brainwash and indoctrinate generations of lawyers, activists, decision makers, and people who end up in Congress. That's the damage of such legal claims, even if it doesn't really change anything, even doesn't change foreign policy of most states really. How do we address this reality? The fact that this demagoguery enshrined in international legal language is being used as an excuse to take politically damaging steps, including most recently on a bilateral level, which does have real effect, unlike the UN resolutions, by Australia in recognizing Jerusalem. And some would argue they interpret this as by denying Israel's rights to assign its own capital, they are denying Jewish heritage inherent therein.
Yeah, that's exactly what they're doing. And they're, again, doing what Yasser Arafat did when he decided that, 1947 was the dividing line. They've come up with some sort of date that they are deciding is relevant. And they're saying, and they also are probably playing a little bit of that game that the anti-Zionist activists do, which is, well, you're really not a people either. And so they're just picking and choosing facts, using definitions, changing definitions to suit their end goal. The reality is that you cannot, you'd have to do like that jewelry peddler did in Jerusalem to me earlier this spring. Just say, okay, 400 years ago, but 401 years ago doesn't matter. I don't know how you get around that problem other than education, and hopefully that this video, this paper will be part of that. But it will take. I think that it comes down to who are the activists, where do they get their information, how much power do they have, and the UN really is sort of a collection of sort of college-aged kids who just throw around terms that don't really have the meanings that they think they have, and that they do damage against their own charter. I mean, other than deconstructing the United Nations, I don't know that there is an answer in the short term, but we have to, I think that through education, through really debating the questions that are raised, like when Australia does something like this, like, why do you have this dividing line? Why do you not go back to 683 or wherever BCE and look at that? I've never seen that question posed to the activists, the political organizations, the NGOs. But again, I think that they go back to this question, this answer of, well, Jews are not a people, and you're actually not even Jews.
Well, Australia's very leftist government claims that it is merely reverting to the status quo under international law without trying to. Basically, they're assigning blame to somebody else who defined it for them and using it as an excuse to fit in with whoever they want to appease for ideological reasons, not necessarily about that. But the crux of the problem is that to reform education, you need to have control of the soft power institutions. 99.9% of the academia in Western countries is controlled by proto-Marxist aligned, elements who have control of the education, have no incentive whatsoever to question most of these findings. And as time goes on, this issue becomes more entrenched. Back in my day, which was quite a long time ago, we had those opportunities to at least have some reasonable discussion and examine all perspectives. But after 20 years, almost 20 years, the situation has changed. Woke ideology has penetrated academia even further. It's become even more difficult for any, even internal dissent, much less larger dissent, dispute, or and so forth. The Marxist elements of the progressive ideology has become much more prominent. And it has this discussion extended well outside academia into political circles that are now giving essentially their voice of approval to these perspectives from the political days, and other institutions that didn't always play such a prominent role. Social media accounts, general state of ignorance, and the more time passes, the more this ignorance is enshrined. And what I'm not seeing is a very aggressive, offensive position to take back control of the language by basically forcing the issue of historic colonial movements and imperial movements into the open. Iran's narrative of Iran's control of the region is not being challenged because Iran is the one paying. Iranian diaspora connected to Iran is the ones paying the bill for Iranian chairs. The fact is, Iran is a multi-ethnic entity that has always had imperial issues internally, and it was also not always Persian in terms of governance. It has attempted to create a pan-Persian identity that just is not a good fit, but most of the world refuses to discuss Arab, Kurdish, Turkic, and other perspectives inside there. The fact is, the same can be said of many other regional issues, minority voices, ethnic and religious minorities, not just Jews, but assorted Christians, Yazidis, and so forth. They've been essentially silenced, and in the academia, they're not being addressed. We're not seeing deep historical understanding of tribal issues and the displacement of different Arab and other tribes by each other in the course of normal warfare throughout the ages, and even growing disputes between different Arab states, which territorial disputes that are being litigated sometimes quite aggressively, that nobody knows that they even exist. The territorial disputes between Egypt and Saudi Arabia. That's been an ongoing issue for a very long time. Dispute between Qatar and Bahrain over islands between Iran and the UAE and so forth. And not to mention Oman and Musandam and
Sure.
those territories. This is just not being studied in the Middle East curriculum, period, by anybody.
No, it's not only not being studied, but they're intentionally preventing it from being introduced in the curricula. One of the things that we have found in the last year is we were asked to take a look at what California is doing with regard to requiring ethnic studies in high schools as a prerequisite to graduation. And so, on the face, that sounds fine. You should understand other cultures, other ethnicities. But when we asked for and ultimately got through freedom of information requests is a curriculum that is exactly as you described. They refused to discuss anything other than the Marxist terminology, the Marxist agenda. We actually found one in a California school district where somebody had said, look, you're going to include discussions of Arabs in under the Asia, sort of the Asia category of ethnicity. Somebody else said, well, then you should discuss Jews as well. If you're going to discuss the Palestinian Arab identity, why wouldn't you discuss the Israeli Jewish identity? Well, because it doesn't exist. It's a religion, and you don't have a right. We'll talk about that in Holocaust studies. Well, I mean, there's a lot to Judaism that is not the Holocaust. I mean, the Holocaust was horrible. My family suffered from it. My mom was a Holocaust survivor, but there's a million things about Jews that are not being taught in schools and that are being withheld from the students about us as an ethnicity, a nationality, the history, how all of the people moved around throughout the course of history from the early ages to the to the Spanish Inquisition, to World War II and afterwards. They will not allow that to be taught, because it will then raise questions in the students' minds. They'll say, well, okay, it sounds like maybe the Jews are not occupiers of their own land. They don't want that even to be brought up. And they fought so hard to prevent that from being included. We're still fighting them, and we may have to go to court, but these groups, very well funded, very well organized, and the other side is not.
Well, it's not that the Jewish world lacks financially well-endowed individuals or entities or organizations that are well practiced in lobbying and in promoting their interests. It's that it has become corrupted and ignorant, and the organizational interests have and disputes in a vet and ideological battles have subsumed the Jewish organized world to the point that they no longer are serving their purpose, and those who are serving their purpose do not have the financial support and backing, because they're not quote unquote activists, and not because they're not doing the same thing but from the other side. Education is not real education. It's complicated, it's challenging, it's not simple or pretty. You can talk about racism in Israel, and it's going to be a very real hard discussion, and it's worth discussing, because there were disputes between different groups, and there was oppression of Sephardic Jews in the very beginning, and it's not a history that the Jewish world wants to discuss among themselves. But at the same time, if you don't know, it's not just simply about, oh, well, Jews are bad or Jews are not Jews and whatever else. It's that the world doesn't know anything about anybody anywhere, because certain parties have funded the curriculum for such a long time that the diversity in the Middle East, the complicated, challenging history of different tribes and sectarian movements and religions and their coexistence and their battles and struggles and their interactions in general are not being studied. And the less people know about these nuances and details, the less they're open to seeing the world as anything but black and white. But the more you know about anything in general and seeing the complications, the more you're open to hearing and challenging the viewpoints on any subject, including even Israel and Palestinians and whatnot. But if people are generally taught to think in very simplistic ways, in Marxist ways, in dialectic ways, as the Marxist narrative terms, the less they're likely to challenge themselves and to think outside whatever is being fed to them and to read anything that does not challenge very emotional, appealing narratives. So, how do we take over these soft power institutions? It remains the internal questions. Yes, it's important to understand the legal issues, the historical issues in question, and to know and to impart that knowledge. But the mechanism for transferring the importance of your paper into something that is practicable on the ground, the answer remains in how do we get those channels back from the brink of complete domination by people who have no incentive whatsoever to look at your paper, much less teach it.
Yeah, it's one of the big problems that we've always faced as activists is to be able to get, sort of fair time for both sides. And it's not happening especially in universities. We've actually gone to universities and, for example, when they have these things called Israel Apartheid Week, we ask them, well, can we have a counterpoint to that? How about Palestinian Terror Week? Just to show why there's a security wall, why there's a military presence. Absolutely not. You'll incite people, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I mean, but Israel Apartheid Week incites too. It's what they're willing to incite, I guess. And I don't, it's going to take a long time, but I think that the best way to do it is just to keep challenging the administrations, force them to be, on record as to why they have this, the double standards, the hypocrisy, and hopefully, I think that people are starting to see it as well. That there is, there isn't this openness that the left, says that they are all about. When you look at things like, free speech right now, they say, everything's about free speech until it's not because you're hurting our feelings. You have to challenge them and you have to be willing to be called names. I mean, I've been called a racist. I've actually been called a Nazi sympathizer. I don't know how. I mean, my family was wiped out by Nazis. I only exist in the United States because my mom was lucky enough to get out. Yet here it is that because I am as much a nationalist for my own people as the Palestinian Arabs are. I get called a Nazi, and they're being called freedom fighters and decolonists, et cetera, et cetera. It's just a matter of spending the same amount of time and effort and getting our message out there.
I'm going to end this with a very subversive proposal, which is, I think, the first step is not to start with the things that are the farthest away from the current situation, trying to teach things that people don't not only not know anything about, but are completely close to hearing. But start with disrupting the narratives in their own terms. Start by teaching Karl Marx, an entire course on Karl Marx and his various perspectives on various things, and then challenging the current narratives in the terms of the original and just questioning, well, in light of X, Y, and Z, what Karl Marx wrote about this, how do you feel about these current texts? Start people to think critically about issues familiar to them, and
Yep.
from there take it to other issues.
Yeah, that's a very interesting idea, and I think it's a great idea. When you look at, let's use the example of a current, very popular politician, AOC. She uses Marxist terms quite a bit. The funny thing is, and she uses it to rail against capitalism, support Palestinian rights. If she actually were to have read Karl Marx, there are many times where Karl Marx is very complimentary about capitalism. And there's as you had used the term nuance before, there's a lot of nuance in Marxism, and some of it is what they think it says. A lot of it isn't. It's simply an economic theory. It's not a political theory. It's not a legal theory. And there is a lot of logic in Marxism if you actually read both sides of what is being said. But forcing people to actually challenge what they think they believe or what they think they know is I think it's an eternal problem. But that is the way to get these things off the table and really into some form of resolution is to understand what you're saying.
I think that's certainly at least a very first step. Whether it will lead to anything else, or whether even that is practical at this point is a question. But I think that's a place to start, and not to start with something that seems the most emotionally rewarding right now, which is dealing directly with the issue, but to start with the things that make more sense to the people who need to be challenged.
Hmm.
But in that
Totally agree.
respect, thank you so much for bringing to attention to these important issues that I think even the people who are deeply active in the field don't always think about, and
Yeah.
certainly don't always themselves understand deeply enough and well enough. And you can't really go challenging anybody unless you yourself become familiar with the history, familiar with the context, and have the tools to at least respond if you have an opportunity to do so. I
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I couldn't have said it better. That really is the key to just the road to making things better, is to really engage and to understand what the real issues are. And it's not being done now. It's just it's like you said earlier, it's emotional. And people like easy answers, and they like things that emotionally make them feel better. And that not often is not reality.
On that cheery note, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
For those watching the program, the Washington Outsider Report will be back as usual next week at 9 p.m. And with you was Marc Greendorfer from the Zachor Legal Institute, and as always, Irina Zuckerman, the Washington Outsider Editor-in-Chief. Thank you very much.
Thank you.